Good morning. This is André Fauteux. I am publisher and editor of La Maison du 21e siècle, or 21st century housing magazine. And today I'm very, very proud to have Linda Birnbaum with us this morning. How are you, Dr. Birnbaum?
I'm doing great and looking forward to our discussion.
So am I. I've been looking forward for a long time. Just to present you, people should know that you're one of the top scientists and female scientists in the history of American medicine. You're a biologist, microbiologist, and Ph.D. in microbiology, and also a world-renowned toxicologist. And I've known you for the last few years as the head of the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, the director of that institute, including its national toxicology program. And I read a little bit about you. You're now semi-retired, very active, over 600 peer-reviewed publications, countless awards, very impressive. I've never seen anyone with so many awards. And you're really a world-renowned expert on chemical pollution. And I saw that you were notably a member of the Institute of Medicine and also of the Ramazzini College. And we can talk about Ramazzini Institute later on. Just to give you a bit of background about myself very quickly, I've been a reporter since 1988 when I wrote, I used to work for the Montreal Gazette, a daily, where I wrote about a little girl who had leukemia, and unfortunately she died. She never got that bone marrow transplant. So I was really affected by that. I had severe backaches in my early 20s, so health was a priority for me. It's always been, and I've always wondered what makes us sick, and especially what makes children sick. And most recently, the last few years, I've talked to a lot of, actually for over 25 years, I've talked to environmental physicians, toxicologists, and others. And Dr. Martha Herbert at Harvard, pediatric neurologist, told me how many kids are sick, and about 1 out of 2 people have chronic diseases today, including children. So just finally, a lot of scientists are saying that it may not be just genetics that make us sick, but maybe the environment and our lifestyle that would pull the trigger. And I'd like you to first comment a little bit about that. And I'll let you continue saying, what are you most proud of that your department, your institute achieved while you were for so many years heading it? And so focusing on the public, what are you most proud of in terms of protecting public health?
That's a very big question, because I have to say that my almost 11 years as director of NIEHS and NTP was a very exciting time for science as well as for me. So I think some of the things I'm very proud of, there are some things that are kind of how NIEHS functions and versus, what goes out to the public. So internally, one of the things that I think I'm most proud of is the fact that I made NIEHS a interactive organization, so that the different parts of the organization, the basic intramural research program, the division of the National Toxicology Program, which I can come back to later, and the extramural program all work together to advance the issues of the environment and public health. I think I totally agree with the comment you made a minute ago, that our environment and is extremely important in our health. I've been heard to say there's nothing that's just genetics, and there's nothing that's just environment. There's always an interaction between the two. You can think of it as a pendulum, and at times things will be more at one end of the pendulum or the other end of the pendulum. But even with inherited Mendelian kind of inheritance health conditions, something like phenylketonuria, which most babies are tested for within the first day or 2 of birth, is dependent upon what the baby is fed. And if you avoid a specific amino acid, that baby will have a perfectly normal brain and development. So there's an example between a very strong genetic determinant and, in this case, an amino acid or nutrition, which can kind of load the gun.
And you saw that in the studies with the twins, of course, eh? How genetics don't really play out everything.
Well, there are lots of studies that have been done with identical twins. I mean, these are very powerful when you can do them, because these twins, identical twins, should have identical sequence of genes and in all their genes. So if you think that DNA is basically has 4 bases, A, G, T, C, they should have exactly the same sequence. But we know today, and I think this is something that I'm proud of, is epigenetics has become extremely important. And our recognition of the importance of epigenetics is that epigenetics is how you tell why, for example, a hair cell is different than a skin cell, is different than a bone cell, is different than a lung cell, etc. For many, many years, we kind of waved our hands and said, oh, they've all got the same DNA. But what happens is the DNA can have modifications put onto it, whether you put on, for example, methyl groups, which in general tend to inhibit the expression of genes, or you take off methyl groups that are already there, or you do things like, for example, that you have your histones, and histones lead to your chromatin structure. DNA is not a long, skinny molecule that looks like spaghetti. It's tightly wound up, and you have 4 kinds of proteins that are involved in that winding up, and you can, for example, methylate or put other groups onto histones, which controls whether those genes are going to be turned on or turned off, for example.
Yeah,
so
epigenetics is really the expression of the genes that are modified by the environment and behavior.
By the environment, by behavior, and just during development. In other words, we know, for example, when conception occurs between an egg and a sperm, in general, there is largely total erasure of all the existing methylation marks on DNA. And then as development proceeds, different parts of the genome get methylated, which basically tells you, okay, so right now we're going to make a limb. And right now we're going to really begin branching in the lungs, or whatever has to be done. So you have development modifies our epigenetic expression, and that basically controls development, and our environment. And I think one thing, again, that I'm really proud of is helping people to realize that the environment needs to be defined very broadly. Many people think of the environment only as chemical contaminants, for example, pollutants. But people think of air pollution somehow a little differently than they do, for example, let's say disinfection byproducts that are in your drinking water. But air pollution is a very complex mix of lots of different chemicals and naturally occurring things as well. So our environment is not only pollutants, it's also things in our nutrition. I mean, what is food? Food is a bunch of chemicals all put together to make our diet. Mm-hmm. And then you have things, for example, like infectious agents. So infectious agents, that includes our microbiome. And our microbiome, we have multiple microbiomes. People often talk about the microbiome, and they're referring to what's in their, say, gut. But the point is, there's a microbiome, multiple microbiomes on your skin, because the microbiomes, for example, let's say under your arms, in your armpits, are different than the microbiome, for example, that might be on your neck or something like that. And there are microbiomes.
What's the statistic again? Are we 1% human and 99% microbes or something like that?
As far as actual number of cells, I believe it's about 100 to 1. I believe you're absolutely right, André. So I think we have to think about the fact that we have infectious agents, and certainly during this time of the pandemic, there is some evidence, and we certainly have evidence, for example, from influenza, that if you're living in a region with a lot of air pollution, you tend to be more susceptible to the viral infection. And there's a lot of experimental data that, experimental animal data, for example, that supports that. So I think the environment also includes, like, say, your lifestyle. You know, I mean, do you drink alcohol? Do you smoke cigarettes? Those things will all impact how you react to things. So those are just some of the examples, but I think we need to look broadly. One thing that I would say I'm pretty proud of, and science hasn't really figured out how to do it, but we need to begin to recognize that we're not exposed to one thing at a time. You know, it's not just our air pollution. It's not just our drinking water. It's not just those viruses. It's not just that nice glass of wine that I had last night. It's the combination. And how do we begin to evaluate that? And some of our grantees actually have done a great job of developing different approaches to look at mixtures. But in general, they're not really the total complexity of the soup in which we live. They may be looking at 3 or 5 or 7 kind of chemicals, but at least it's a start. So those are some of the things that I'm proud of. I think some of the other thing is, and that kind of gets me to the whole issue of the exposome, which is often defined as the totality of what we're exposed across our lifetime.
How do you spell that? Exposome?
Exposome. You know, there are lots of omes. You have the genome and the microbiome.
Okay, that's a new term for me.
And the exposome has to do with exposure.
Total.
And so it's EXPOSOME. And so we're beginning to try to look in an integrated measure at the totality of what we're exposed to. So I mentioned it as mixtures, but something that makes it, I think, even more complicated than the fact that you could be exposed to lots of things at one point in time. Over the course of your life, what you're exposed to may change. So there's also a time constant that has to be thought about. So I think that's very exciting. Another thing that I'm really proud of is trying to take the research that we do and work very closely with impacted communities. You know, I think we all know that disadvantaged populations, whether it's because of the color of their skin, whether it's because where they live, whether it's because of their socioeconomic status, all that kind of impacts how they will respond. But you can't make people change what they do if they don't understand the importance. So I used to go out and meet with many different communities every year, reaching out to them, trying to understand from them what their issues are. And we would involve the communities. So for example, in our grants program, and I started to mention how NIEHS works, but basically much of our funding goes out to peer-reviewed grants programs. And some of these are individual investigator-initiated grants. Many of them are consortiums that are formed. So we've had consortiums in environment and neurodegenerative diseases, breast cancer, air pollution, children's health, minority health. I mean, many, many different areas. We also have a large program, which is really unique to the National Institutes of Health, of a Superfund program. Now, Superfund is legislation that was passed in about 1986 that established funding for not only EPA, but NIEHS and the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry to try to understand the health impacts of communities who are living near Superfund sites. And those are hazardous waste sites, basically. So in all of the different kinds of integrated programs that we have, and again, many are also associated with training the next generation of environmental health scientists, I required that there be a community engagement core. And I say very definitively community engagement, not community outreach. We don't want scientists helicoptering in to a community and saying, oh, we're going to solve your problems and then helicopter out. We need to have actual engagement between the communities and between the researchers. And I think this type of work has grown and expanded and has really made a difference.
Give me an example, please.
Okay, so let me see. There are lots of examples. I can think of one here in North Carolina. We have contamination in one of our major river systems here with chemicals called PFAS, per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. PFAS, there are thousands of these chemicals. Only about 600 are currently being intentionally made, but
like
there are
non-stick.
Yes, they're often non-stick. So things like your Teflon pans, things like your Scotch guarded shoes or tablecloths or carpets, stain resistant. Many of those things have PFAS on them. Now, some of the most different PFAS have been regulated to a certain extent, but unfortunately, we have a whole history, not only the US, but the world, of alternatives which are untested.
Exactly.
And we move from something that we understand is problematic to something that we know nothing about and haven't tested it before we use it. And so that's happened.
And industry wants us to believe that the new product is better, of course. It's safer.
Well, often because there's no data on it. Nobody's looked at it and there's no requirement. Unlike drugs, which at least in the United States have to go through a very rigorous testing process before they can be put on the market, new chemicals can basically get on the market with almost no information at all.
So the implication between scientists and communities on PFAS?
Okay, so with PFAS, we have this whole community. We have certainly 300,000 people, maybe 1 million people who are exposed to elevated PFAS in their drinking water. From one of the producers of PFAS, which dumped these chemicals for many, many years into the water. And the community now is working very, very, very closely. Different parts of the community are working with one of our grantees, who have a consortium to try to understand what is really the level of pollution that these people are dealing with, both in their water and in their own bodies, and how can, trying to understand what that means for their health. And some of these communities working together now have actually gotten together with other scientists and have actually petitioned the United States EPA to do extensive testing on many of these PFAS, which are in their water, which there's no testing information at all on them. So I would say this has empowered the community to kind of know how do we go about this? Where do we go forward? So that's just one example. So, I mean,
well, you should be commended for this, because of course there are a lot of inconvenient truths out there. And I read a little bit about you in Scientific American, how industry lobbyists and their lawyers will sit around the table, or congressional hearings where you would talk. And but it brings me to my next question. That's burning on everyone's lips. Do you use these products, these non-stick, non-stain? What do you do at home? What are the underestimated pollutants we should most be wary of? And what changes have you made in your own lifestyle from the discoveries of your
I'll take the changes first, or what I've done. First of all, I should say I'm a pragmatist. So I do what I can do and what makes sense to me. So like I stopped microwaving in plastic 25 years ago or more, because it was clear to me, and the science was clear, that as you raise the temperature, chemicals which are not bonded to the plastic but are present will begin to migrate out. And if you cook in plastic, that's going to come into your food. And so I stopped doing that years ago. You can microwave perfectly well. You can use paper. Don't use paper with PFAS on it, though.
Yeah.
But, or you can use ceramic dishes or anything like that. You can perfectly reasonably heat in that.
But coffee and styrofoam is okay?
Well, styrofoam is a extensive polymer. I would say in the production of styrofoam, some styrene, which is the monomer, can leak out. Styrene is reasonably anticipated to be a human carcinogen. My national toxicology program, which is, excuse me one second, let me turn off the phone. which is legislatively mandated to evaluate the carcinogenicity of compounds, conducted an extensive review of that and concluded that it was certainly probably a human carcinogen. And there's new data which is coming up to support those associations. But the point is, not much styrene is leaking out, but I don't heat in styrene. I try to avoid styrene containers as much as possible. Before the pandemic, if I was going out to dinner, I'd often take a ceramic container with me to put my leftovers into to take them home, rather than getting a styrene kind of a styrofoam kind of container. But part of my concern with styrofoam is not just if styrene leaks out of it, but the point that styrofoam is going to be with us for a million years. And do we really want to be leading to, as far as our lifetime is concerned, permanent contamination with styrofoam? So that's one thing I've done. Another thing, I have to say, I was taken in by the industry with PFAS coming out when they stopped making the two most common, or PFAS that we really know the most about, because those have been the ones that studied, PFOA and PFOS. And they announced that they weren't going to use them anymore. So your Scotchgard is perfectly fine. So I happily threw out my old Scotchgard and got new Scotchgard and happily sprayed my new hiking boots or whatever. I don't do that anymore because I realized that the alternatives turn out to do many of the same things that the original compounds did. I don't, for example, I got rid of my Teflon pots. I never had very many. I've been always perfectly okay with the pots that I got when I was married over 50 years ago. So I have them. But there are now nonstick cookware which does not have any PFAS in it.
Ceramic based?
I believe so, but you have to be careful. If you go to the store, you may see signs on a lot of the nonstick cookware that says no PFOA. That's a warning. That means it's got other PFAS in it, the ones that they know less about. So you got to kind of inspire beware. I think another example is BPA. I mean, that is really an example of very clear unfortunate substitution. BPA,
that's in polycarbonate, the water bottles?
Used to be extensively in polycarbonate. That's why your drinking water bottles were hard. I'm not talking about when you buy water in bottles, which most of us shouldn't probably do, but your hiking water bottles or something, and baby bottles and sippy cups with a hard styrofoam plastic, and that usually contain BPA. Well, here in the United States, BPA was actually banned from baby bottles and sippy cups. I believe it was 2012, and that was really in response to people saying, I don't want that in my baby's bottles anymore. And the result was that actually industry pulled it, and then our FDA, Food and Drug Administration, banned it from those uses. Unfortunately, now what we have are what sometimes we call whack-a-mole or chemical conveyor belt, but we've moved from BPA, for example, which used to be used extensively for thermal paper. So your thermal paper receipts were printed, there was BPA on the surface of that paper, to something called BPS, which is structurally very related. The industry really didn't have to change its process much and didn't change anything. So you went from something you knew was bad to something you knew nothing about. And the studies now are demonstrating that BPS and BPAF and BPF and BPB, and there's a whole alphabet soup of compounds that are very structurally related to BPA that are being used. And the testing that has been done on these, and it's still fairly limited, suggests that they do many of the same things. Mm-hmm. So, we have to kind of consumer beware.
Yeah, well, we could talk for hours about this. I know that the receipts that you get from your supermarket, that's that thermal paper that gives you hormonal disruptors, which you're an expert in that field. But I have other questions, but just to give the public references, I like to talk about the Environmental Working Group, Epidemic Answers, which have a great report called The Path to Recovery, How to Heal Children with All These Chronic Diseases. But is there maybe are there one or two other references for the general public you'd like to give?
Well, you mentioned the Environmental Working Group, EWG, and they have a great website with all kinds of information. So when you go to buy your sunscreen, which people are putting on their children now pretty much all the time to avoid, because nobody wants to end up with different kinds of skin cancer. And they will list for you what are the least toxic, not only to people, but to the environment. For example, they have something else related to these PFAS chemicals. They have something else related to BPA. So I find the EWG's website a very rich source. There are others. For example, the Sierra Club has some very good websites to use. There are different organizations that you can go to that have good information. But I think if you don't know, is there a place to go? You can query, for example, EWG's website to get more information and get someone to talk to you about it. So I think that's a great.
Okay. Thank you. This is a book that I was told about. I asked Dr. John McLennan, who was president of the Environmental Medicine Society in Canada about 25 years ago. I asked him, what's the best book on this issue? And years ago, he told me about this one that really says that it's not only about the dose makes the poison, right? With this chemical soup. I actually interviewed Jules Brodeur. I don't know if you heard of a toxicologist from the University of Montreal. Many years ago, he wrote that he just studied styrene and xylene. Xylene and not benzene, but the
toluene?
Toluene and xylene. He just combined those two molecules and the toxicity was multiplied. And that brings me to my big question today. The Quebec Institute of Public Health reviewed 4,000 papers recently. And they concluded, they believe beyond a reasonable doubt that multiple chemical sensitivity, all of their symptoms are explained by chronic anxiety. And they claim to have rebutted the hypotheses that there is a relationship between MCS, multiple chemical sensitivity, and the toxicity of chemicals present at normal concentrations. So I'd like to have your comment on this, please.
I think one of the things is, what do we mean by normal concentrations? If they're chemicals that never existed before, is any exposure a problem? Because our bodies have not adapted to them. I think that's something we have to ask. I also think that anxiety can cause a huge range of chronic health effects, but what started the anxiety? I think in many cases, people with MCS report having had a very high exposure to something. And it's like that was the trigger. So they did get sick. It wasn't a normal background level. It was an extremely high level. I'll never forget that we had a technician in another lab, and I'm going back probably 30 years ago to this, and she spilled, a bottle broke, and she spilled a tremendous amount of, it was some kind of organic solvent. She got it on herself. It was all over the lab, and she was sick, understandably, because she had high levels of exposure. But when she recovered from that, again, any exposure led to symptomology. So that could be anxiety. But I did think that the report that just came out from Quebec does say that this is a real problem. Whatever reason, this anxiety is associated with all kinds of effects. But I would suggest—
They say it explains all symptoms. Do you agree that anxiety explains all of the symptoms of MCS?
I don't know the answer to that. I think that is something that is worth examining, but I don't think that we can eliminate the hypothesis that a high exposure to something is what, you know, people actually had a reaction to the chemicals, and that has resulted in their being anxious. So I think that, you know, I think we're beginning to get somewhere trying to understand this. It's a very difficult, very, very difficult topic to study. And it is compounded by, you know, people's feelings.
But what are physicians to do? Now they're going to base their diagnosis and prescription on what the Public Health Institute said. We'll send these people to the shrink.
Lots of primary care physicians do a lot of counseling, and as well as going to the shrink, and, you know, trying to treat the symptoms of anxiety. Maybe that will help. I think that would be, you know, we don't have the studies really to prove that that will make a difference in the case of MCS.
Yeah, but at Women's College of the University of Toronto, Lynn Marshall, Rena Bray have an environmental health clinic, and they say that doctors usually don't take a good exposure history of their patients.
I'm not surprised to hear that from them. I think in general, most physicians get almost no training in issues of environmental health. They hear about lead, they may hear about air pollution, but not much else. I mean, I have my son and daughter-in-law are both physicians, and I remember asking them, well, how much training did you have? And my son said in all of med school, they had 1 hour of training. So that was something else that I did towards the end of my time at NIEHS. There is a program between EPA and the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry called the PACU program, which is basically training for physicians in environmental health, where they would go and spend a year, you know, getting extra training in environmental health. And we actually, towards the end of my tenure at NIEHS, established, or in the process of establishing, and funding like a postdoctoral training program for physicians to get that training they need. I think that is a problem, that physicians just are not, don't know. Plus, I don't know how it works in Canada, but here in the US, many times, because of the way insurance works, people have a very limited amount of time with their physician. I mean, it's set in advance, 8 minutes or 15 minutes, and they just never have the time to ask the appropriate questions.
The fact that you headed the National Toxicology Program to me was important, because it's thanks to C.C. Doucette of Massachusetts who introduced me to you. So I thank her for you being here today again. The cell phone study that Ron Melnick designed, I'd like to talk a little bit about that. It was really notable that in 2016, 2 years before its publication, your team alerted the FDA, which financed this study, I believe, to get ready for this publication, which came out in 2018.
FDA did not put any money into this study.
Okay. They asked the question.
They were the ones, NTP works by a process of nomination, and the nomination can come from inside experts or other federal agencies or the general public. And FDA had nominated cell phone radiation for study back in about, I want to say maybe the late 90s, that it was initially nominated.
Okay. So the FDA asked the question, do cell phones cause cancer? And Ron Melnick said that the hypothesis was no, but then they found yes, that they were able to cause the same types of tumors, schwannomas. The myelin, which insulates our nerves, was attacked, in this case in the hearts of male rats. But is it a coincidence that it's the same type of tumor that will affect humans over the long run? Some people will get types of schwannomas in the ear, in the brain, salivary glands, I believe, which brings us to the big question. Radiofrequencies were classified possible carcinogens in 2001, and now a lot of scientists, including Anthony B. Miller, who was head of epidemiology at the National Cancer Institute in Toronto for 15 years, he believes it should be a class 1 carcinogen. Can you explain a little bit about how important this NTP study and what does it point to for humans?
Sure. So this was a extremely expensive, intensive, long-lasting study that we conducted in male and female rats and mice. There was a lot of preliminary work done because we know that radiofrequency radiation can cause heating of tissues, and we wanted to avoid that. So we did a lot of preliminary studies to make sure there wasn't any problem with getting a rise in temperature of the animals. And that led to the kinds of dosages, and the dosages related to how much radiation they received. These animals were exposed 10 minutes on and 10 minutes off for 18 hours. Now, people might say, well, that's how many people, speak on the phone like that. I think we have to remember there was no way that we could tape a cell phone onto the backs or the heads of the rats to totally mimic what people were having. But this was the best we could do. These studies, we funded construction of specially treated chambers, which would contain the radiation, the radiofrequency radiation, so that the animals would not be exposed to anything outside of the chamber. The animals lived in their cages for the 2 years of the study. Actually, many of the animals were also exposed during gestation and during their early life stages. And we did see that the animals who were exposed in utero were lower birth weight and didn't catch up with weight till later on. And we do know, by the way, that low birth weight is associated with a greater risk, for example, of cancer in general, as well as obesity and type 2 diabetes and so on. Anyway, but what we found, this is the SAR is the specific absorption that occurs in the animals. And I think one point that's really important to see is that the heart is a major absorption sink in rats and mice. In part, they're little animals, it's pretty close to the surface. So that's why we believe that schwannomas of the heart, as well as there was a lot of heart pathology that we saw in the female rats as well as the male rats. The schwannomas, we only saw the statistically significant increase in the male rats. The other tumor that we did see, which we didn't see a great dose response on, but were a glioma, which is very similar to the human glioblastoma. And both the glioblastoma and what are called the acoustic neuromas, which are the human analog of the rodent schwannoma tissue, have been observed in different epidemiological studies. I should say the 2011 IARC decision that to rate radiofrequency radiation as used in cell phones as a possible human carcinogen.
And not only cell phones, they confirmed it was all radiofrequency exposures.
That's correct. So, let me just segue for a minute. I mentioned before that I'm pragmatic. So wireless radiation is all around us, maybe too much. But for example, I almost never talk on my cell phone except in speaker mode, or using some kind of headphone as opposed to holding it to my ear. Because we know that radiofrequency radiation, it's related to the distance that to where you're. So why do I want to put something up against my brain that may cause a problem? And of course, we know that our skulls are thinner in young children than they are in adults, so that more radiation would have the opportunity to penetrate. I should say, when we came out with our report, there was a great deal. In 2016, we did present to the FDA and to other parts of the National Institutes of Health, our findings, there was a great deal of, I would say, resistance and disbelief, despite the significance of the studies, which we had to deal with. We put our study on archives, bioarchives, which is a pre-publication site that many people are using a lot. It's being used extensively today with the SARS-CoV-2 information, that people put it out so that we could get information from other scientists and people looking at that. And that led to some modifications. I should say it's not unusual in the US government for a government document to take several years from initial report to final version. It goes through extensive interagency review among different federal agencies. It goes through extensive opportunity for public comment, which includes not only community members, for example, but also, for example, the industrial contributors. And then it goes through a very intensive and extensive peer review panel, where we bring in experts in the field and have a peer review meeting. And my memory is that this PFAS meeting, when it occurred, occupied, instead of our normal would be anywhere from a half a day to a day and a half, took 3.5 days because of the need for all kinds of different, different.
And the public really needs information. I'm showing here a slide from the Environmental Health Trust website, which is actually advice from Apple saying that we should keep cell phones at least 15 millimeters away from the body.
Yeah, it's not only Apple. All the cell phone manufacturers have always had that advice because they want to avoid the heating that can occur.
The thermal effect, yeah.
Correct.
And so if you're putting it for a few minutes on your head, on your body, your iPad also, you're going to heat tissues. And all the experts agree that there's a risk to the body. But now there's this debate about the non-thermal effects, such as cancer. I'm sure you know Leonard Hardell.
Yes, I do.
I met him in Brussels in 2015. And he's an oncologist in Sweden, but also a great epidemiologist. And he's interested in many of the fields that the substances you've studied. I asked him, what are you best known for? And he said in the late 70s, he started studying dioxin and later PCBs and later glyphosate, how do you pronounce it? Or Roundup.
Glyphosate.
Yeah, or Roundup. And today, or the last 15 years, he's the world-renowned scientist who first linked cell phone use for 10 years and greater risk of glioma. So to me, it was proof that even if industry wants to attack these scientists, he's got such great credentials. I think we should be listening to him. Do you agree to that?
Well, I agree. I mean, I think that radiofrequency radiation can have a multiplicity of effects, not only cancer. It appears to have some developmental effects as well, among other kinds of effects. And we just have to be, we could say that nothing is without some risk. So we have to work to minimize the risks that we can. So for me, not using my cell phone, holding it up to my head, or certainly not doing it frequently, making sure that, we've all seen the picture of babies with an iPad where they know how to turn the pages on the iPad. They wouldn't know how to do it in a book, but they know how with the iPad. I think we should be reducing the exposure that our young children have. And again, making sure that they don't hold the phone up to their ear. It's not only the NTP that has found these cancer results, the Ramazzini Institute outside of Bologna in Italy has conducted
cell tower type exposure, very, very weak exposures.
Weak exposures, but also approaching their highest dose was similar to our lowest dose, or approached our lowest dose and got essentially the same tumorigenic response. I really, I really think we could use a really intensive, extensive study of, say, cell phone use in the population. There was a study that was done, a very large study, or at least 10,000 or maybe more people, but it was early on in the use of cell phones, when people might have only used cell phones for a year or two. And the question about, do you use cell phones, was yes or no, or have you ever used a cell phone, yes or no. That doesn't give you the information you really need to know. So I think there are still opportunities there.
Yeah, it's really the intensity of the dose, but the duration. Dr. Hardell found that if you start using a cell phone regularly before the age of 20, you can up to quintuple your brain cancer risk. You mentioned the iPad in children. One day I think we're going to say it's criminal to give it to them. This is an adapter that you can use to plug an iPad or an iPhone to surf on the internet, not make a phone call, by turning off your Wi-Fi and your Bluetooth. People aren't aware of this technology. But many years ago, Sir William Stewart, scientific advisor of the UK, said kids under 15 should never use a cell phone. So people just don't know about this. I'd like to share another slide.
Sure.
Ron Melnick.
André, I should mention I only have 10 more minutes.
Yeah, so do I.
Okay, good.
Well, I'm very aware, very aware. Ron Melnick designed the NTP cell phone rat study, and he's working with the Environmental Health Trust today, and he's really disappointed that the FDA is now downplaying those results. So my answer is the FDA another captured agency, as Norm Alster of Harvard said with the FCC? It's always this revolving door issue of people in government are used to be in industry, and when they retire from government, they go and work for industry, which is not your case, it seems. But do you agree that the FDA has cast doubt on the?
I find it just very disappointing, their response. They're the ones who wanted the study, and I think I don't totally understand why they downplay it. They're making the comments that what happens in animals doesn't necessarily happen in people, and I guess that is true up to a point. But when you see several effects that happen in several different studies, both human observational studies as well as animal studies, and there's mechanistic information as well, why wouldn't we think that some people might not be susceptible? Nature is inherently conservative. It tends to do the same things and run things the same way again and again. So I don't understand it. Your question about, is the FDA another captured agency? I think at least in the United States, many of our regulatory agencies, unfortunately, do have a revolving door policy with people coming in from industry and then going back to industry, or people who start in the government and then move to industry. I think that is a problem, and I think that may be a problem in the FDA. That's not to say that there aren't a lot of great, hardworking, honest, totally honest people in these agencies, but I do think there's a problem, and I'm not the only one.
Of course. Thank you for your answers. Finally, I was really impressed to see one day that the NIH Health and Buildings Conference had panelists talking about EMFs on August 30th, 2018. I don't know if you were involved at all in that event, but the information disappeared from the NIH website shortly after. And to me, again, it's a fact that it's an inconvenient truth. We have cell towers on hospitals, on schools, or close to school grounds. What do you expect in the next couple of years? Do you think that prudent avoidance of EMFs and RFs, especially the wireless, do you think governments will, like New Hampshire just had a commission on 5G health effects? Is that issue, is government always trying to downplay that, or do you think that more and more scientists and politicians will have more courage to talk about it?
So I think that, at least in my country, often things happen at the local level before they happen at the federal level. So you're beginning to see there are regulations being put into place in certain communities, in certain states. I think it's going to take a while for that to kind of trickle up to the federal level before it. And I guess when I think about, to me, I think when you can use wired technology, there are advantages to doing that. I think when you can't, I think just don't hold it too close to yourself. Keep it away from your body. Again, as I said, that's, to me, is the pragmatic approach that I can take at this point.
Finally, we have about 5 minutes. What would you like to share with the public, but also scientists, about the importance of considering environmental health?
I think I started off by saying everything is both our environment and our genes. We can't change our genes, at least not easily at this point. With CRISPR-Cas9, there are certain ways that you can begin to deal somatically with certain genetic issues. But we have to do what we can to have a healthier environment. And that is broadly defined, as I said. It's not just less exposure to synthetic chemicals. I think we need more information. There needs to be more transparency. I don't know about you, if I go to buy something, I mean, that print is so small. Even with glasses, I usually can't read what it says. I come home and get a magnifying glass, but by that point I've already bought it, which is too late. So I think we need more information readily available. From the FDA, there is a report, several reports actually, that came out recently about the levels of PFAS in cosmetics. So, I mean, I was with one of my daughters and she was buying some new mascara, and the salesperson was saying, oh, this waterproof mascara is just what you want. And I said, no. Because essentially that was like essentially all the samples they looked at of waterproof mascara had PFAS in them. So there has to be more communication. People have to understand. At the same point, as a pragmatist, you can't drive yourself crazy. Mm-hmm. That's not going to help you either. Anxiety, as we've talked about before, can cause lots of chronic physical symptoms. So you have to do what you can do and what makes sense to you. If it turns out that your drinking water has contaminants, whether they're naturally occurring, like in parts of the Southwest, where there are a lot of heavy metals in your water, you may want to buy those 5 or, get delivered those 5 gallons of water for drinking, rather than drinking stuff that comes out of your tap. Much of our tap water in the US has low levels of things like disinfection byproducts. Unfortunately, it can have high levels of PFAS. So I think do what you can that makes sense to you. If it's a bad air day, and we're hearing more and more and more about them, the wildfires have come across the country, and I assume some went to Canada as well. I remember when there were big fires in British Columbia a year or 2 ago. Those aren't the days you want to go for a 20-mile run, even a 5-mile run. Think about buying an electric car. We know that, yes, the electricity that powers that where I live may come from coal-fired power plants, but there's less being used than if I'm directly using it. So I'm very happy to plug in my car and drive it that way. So do what makes sense, do what you can. And another thing would be, obesity is a major health problem. Some of it may relate to endocrine disrupting chemicals that are in our food or we were exposed to before we were born, but try to eat a healthy diet. And again, you can go on EWG's website and find out about the Dirty Dozen, for example. Just a couple of what I see as reasonable things for us all to do.
Linda Birnbaum, it was an honor and a great pleasure to speak to you today. I think we could go on for hours. Maybe we should do a more focused one on a specific topic one of these days, but thank you very much for your generosity and congratulations on your career, which is carrying on, teaching students now, doing more research.
Continuing research, continuing working with students, a lot of mentoring, and a lot of science communication. You know, I think our public needs to understand what the science is saying, and not everyone can explain it in ways that people understand.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. Namaste.
Namaste. Take good care.
Keep well.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
You too.